Fair use. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing.
Before we start the video, make sure to subscribe to my channel.
Why does everybody say you're only 16 years old?
And crime weren't distant problems but an everyday reality. His childhood was marked by hardship, an overcrowded household, little money, and a community weighed down by struggle. Like countless others raised in those conditions, he faced pressures and dangers most people can't imagine. But unlike most, his path became one of violence that left a permanent mark on the city. By the time he was just 15 years old, Louding's name was already associated with death. He had developed a reputation as one of Baton Rouge's most feared young killers, accused of being responsible for 9 murders before even reaching adulthood. To call him dangerous would be an understatement. He was referred to by some as a demon or an angel of death, labels that reflected the brutality of his actions.
See, y'all don't know nothing about Marlo, Mike. That's why I'm here. To educate y'all. And me, I ain't gonna lie. But there's some of the niggas y'all favorite rappers rap about. Yeah. Nussy!
To carry that kind of weight, to take that many lives at such a young age, is horrifying on every level, both for the victims and for the reality of a child becoming an executioner. Part of understanding who he became means understanding where he came from. Louding's upbringing was surrounded by violence long before he ever picked up a gun. As a young adolescent, he witnessed a killing firsthand, an image that never left him, a trauma impossible to shake. Experiences like that are enough to fracture anyone, but in his world, trauma didn't lead to healing or counseling, it hardened people. It distorted childhood into something unrecognizable. For a kid who barely had the chance to know stability, this kind of environment shaped his view of life, death, and survival. What happened to Marlo Mike isn't just about one person, it's a reflection of an entire environment that produces stories like his. Growing up in such conditions scars mental health, disrupts education, twists coping mechanisms, and can push children toward paths they were never supposed to walk. His story, as brutal as it is, serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when violence becomes a child's teacher. Michael Louding's nickname, Marlo Mike, came directly from the infamous character Marlo Stanfield in The Wire, a cold, calculating figure known for both his body count and his ability to outmaneuver the police. The nickname
I ain't know that. That was new information. Y'all gotta go watch The Wire. I watched the whole series like a few years ago, but I remember Marlo Stanfield. He became a boss. And he was the crazy one out of all the bosses.
Wasn't just given at random, it reflected the path he was already walking. In school, Louding struggled almost from the start. His academics were weak, and given the circumstances of his environment, this wasn't unusual. Kids growing up in poverty, surrounded by violence, often find it difficult to focus in the classroom when survival is the more pressing concern. Still, there were glimpses of potential. At one point, he attended a military-style program designed for troubled youth. The discipline and structure of that environment gave him a brief sense of stability. It provided a routine, something he hadn't known before, and for a while, he managed to do better. But the program was temporary, and once it ended, Louding was thrown back into the chaos of the regular public school system. Without the structure, his progress collapsed. Eventually, he was expelled from middle school after being caught with a gun on campus, a decision that pushed him even further away from any kind of normal adolescence. Mike had a reputation for
That boy was in them streets early. He got caught with a gun at middle school. That's like 6th grade. How old are you in 6th grade? 11? 12? It gotta be 11, 12. That's crazy.
Anger issues, but according to family members, he wasn't always violent. They described him as a boy who didn't lash out physically at others, at least not in his younger years. But time changed him. The older he got, the more he spiraled into the streets, and the more the streets shaped him. His juvenile record grew quickly, filled with run-ins with the law. His mother saw the signs and was worried. Mike admitted to her that he heard voices in his head, something she desperately wanted him to get help for. But he refused, rejecting the idea of treatment or intervention.
We're not skipping past that. He heard what? That's called schizophrenia. I know some schizophrenic people is out there. Hey, look, listen. Take your imaginary shooting gun ass in the house. Ah, they thought I was about to say something impactful. Get the fuck out of here.
As his world grew darker, he found a mentor and father figure in Baton Rouge rapper Lil Boosie. By the age of 14, Marlo Mike was living with Boosie, who legally became his guardian. The relationship between the two was complex. Boosie saw him as a son, while the streets viewed him as something else entirely, Boosie's alleged hitman. Even as just a teenager, Mike had already built a reputation as a stone-cold killer, someone who carried out murders with a level of detachment that terrified both his enemies and the community around him.
Yeah, that's the guy I remember. Oh man, I did remember that ball spot though. Had a 42 Doug whistle that one.
Torrance Ivy Hatch Jr., better known by his stage name Boosie Badass, formerly Lil Boosie, was born on November 14, 1982, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A central figure in Southern hip-hop, Boosie came up in the 1990s as part of the rap collective Concentration Camp before striking out on his own with the release of his debut album Youngest of the Camp in 2000. Soon after, he linked up with the late Pimp C's label, Trill Entertainment, dropping his second studio album For My Thugs in 2002. Over the years, Boosie would cement himself as one of the defining voices of Baton Rouge rap, releasing 7 solo albums, 6 collaborative projects, and dozens of mixtapes, making his name synonymous with raw, street-centered lyricism. Boosie wasn't just a rapper in the eyes of Baton Rouge, he was an icon, and for young people like Marlo Mike Louding, he was larger than life. When Marlo was just 14, Boosie took him in, serving as a mentor and legal guardian. To Marlo, Boosie wasn't just a rapper he looked up to, he was a father figure. But the environment around Boosie, and the lifestyle he lived, didn't provide the stability someone like Marlo desperately needed. Instead of pulling him away from negative influences, it threw him deeper into the same destructive cycle. Being unstable himself, Marlo was surrounded by others facing their own demons, and those influences only fueled what was already a dangerous path. Meanwhile, Boosie's own life was unraveling under the weight of his legal troubles. In October 2008, he was arrested after police found marijuana and a Glock in his car. A year later, on September 22, 2009, he pled guilty to his third offense, possession of marijuana. The next day, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison.
Damn.
Things only got worse when Judge Chip
Over some weed? That's crazy. I thought thought he was doing time for something else.
Moore doubled the sentence after determining Boosie had violated probation while awaiting sentencing. During this period, he was placed under electronic monitoring and house arrest, caught in a legal battle that would drag his name deeper into controversy. For Marlo Mike, living under Boosie's wing meant being tied not only to his music and reputation but also to his criminal entanglements. What might have been intended as mentorship became something much darker, eventually linking the young teenager to crimes that would define the rest of his short-lived freedom. Michael Marlo McLeod grew up with constant run-ins with the law. As a juvenile, he was arrested numerous times for charges such as simple battery, criminal mischief, unlawful entry, resisting an officer, criminal damage to property, and possession of dangerous substances. On top of that, he was tied to robberies, gun possession, and other violent crimes. Selling drugs became his main source of income, and whatever money
that nigga was out here. That nigga was out here. In them streets, baby.
He made usually went toward feeding his habits, weed and lean being his drugs of choice. His addiction ran so deep that he even admitted to killing someone for $2,800, just so he could buy more. On October 21, 2009, his most infamous crime took place. At midnight, 6 rounds from a 9mm handgun were fired through the front window of a house on Vermilion Drive. Inside, 35-year-old Terry Boyd was struck and killed instantly, collapsing on a brown leather couch that quickly soaked in blood. Neighbors reported seeing 2 men running toward the train tracks nearby. Boyd had only recently returned home after serving a 5-year sentence at Winfield Correctional Facility, having been out for just a month. When police searched the scene, they found a disposable camera, $402 in cash, and traces of morphine, marijuana, and codeine in Boyd's system.
Everybody was on that lean. Everybody was on that lean. It still is. On that lean.
The murder of Terry Boyd quickly spiraled into something far bigger than just another killing in Baton Rouge. Lil Boosie himself was charged with first-degree murder, prosecutors alleging that he had ordered Boyd's death for $2,800, a hit carried out by Marlo Mike. According to their case, it was the act of a teenage hitman tormented by the voices in his head, voices that screamed one command over and over: kill. Boosie's defense team, led by attorney Jason Williams, pushed back hard against the accusations, maintaining his innocence and claiming that Marlo had not been acting on Boosie's orders at all. Instead, Williams argued that the crime had been tied to Michael Ghost Judson and Adrian Pittman, pointing to their own motives. Just weeks before Boyd's murder, Ghost had been robbed for $720, supposedly by Boyd, while Pittman was said to have carried a long
$720. Boy, they ain't even rent money now. They used to be rent money. That was a nigga whole rent. In 09. I'm just putting it out there, man. Y'all just do not know. Times has changed.
Standing grudge against him. In the hours before the shooting, Boosie, Pittman, and Ghost had been discussing a letter that Pittman received from Angola inmate Lee Lucas. The letter claimed that Boyd had been making threats from behind bars, promising to settle scores once he got out and specifically naming Boosie as a target. That night, prosecutors said, Boosie told the others he would put up $25,000 to have Boyd killed. Later that night, Adrian Pittman drove Marlo Mike and Michael Ghost Judson to North Stevendale Road, near Vermilion Drive. Pittman stayed close in his van while the two went to track down Boyd. Once Ghost spotted him inside the house, Marlo opened fire through the window, striking Boyd and ending his life instantly. Afterward, Pittman picked them up and drove back to Boosie's residence. There, according to testimony, Boosie handed Marlo Mike $2,800 for carrying out the hit. Pittman later testified in court, admitting his role and pointing to Ghost and Mike as the ones who carried out the shooting. Prosecutors also introduced evidence connecting Marlo to 4 other ambush-style shootings, building a larger picture of his violent pattern. Without DNA or direct eyewitnesses, the state's case leaned heavily on a taped jailhouse confession from Marlo Mike, as well as cell phone records placing him at Boosie's recording studio before and after the murder. Additional evidence included a tattoo Marlo allegedly got just weeks later, an AK-47 paired with the phrase "Yo Boosie, who's next?" and lyrics from Boosie's own tracks, 187 and Body Bag, recorded on the night Boyd was killed. Prosecutors framed the motive around a letter Boosie supposedly received, warning that Terry Boyd planned to jack and slap him after his release from prison. The defense countered that no such letter ever existed, insisting instead that Boosie and Boyd were on good terms, pointing out that Boosie even had a child with Boyd's sister. Beyond the murder of Terry Boyd, Marlo Mike was tied to 5 more killings, all committed within a 14-month window, a spree that left a bloody mark on Baton Rouge.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a year, bucko. Them rookie numbers, nigga. Get them numbers up. Nah, I'm just playing. Hey, look. 14 months. That boy was active.
Among the victims was local rapper Chris Jackson, better known as Nusi, who was gunned down inside a home on America Street on February 9, 2009. In videotaped statements given to authorities, Marlo Mike claimed that Lil Boosie wanted Nusi stamped out due to an ongoing feud between the two. According to Mike, it was Ghost who relayed Boosie's wishes to him. By the time Mike revealed this in May 2010, Ghost was already dead, but Mike insisted that Ghost had acted as his accomplice during the shooting. Mike told detectives that after Nusi was killed, he spoke directly with Boosie. In his words, Boosie said, "Ghost told me you all hit that boy. I like that." Portions of these statements were later played in State District Judge Don Johnson's courtroom during a hearing on a motion by Mike's defense attorney to have them suppressed. Despite the accusations, Boosie was never charged in connection with Nusi's murder. Prosecutors argued they lacked proof of direct contact between Boosie and Mike before the shooting, and with Ghost being the one who allegedly passed along Boosie's orders, the state's case couldn't hold. According to Mike's taped statements, both he and Ghost were present the night of the killing, firing shots into the home before Mike put a bullet in Nusi's head. In one account, Mike even described Ghost lifting him up to the window so he could take the shot. He further claimed that Boosie paid Ghost $15,000 for the job, with Ghost later passing $2,000 of that money on to Mike.
R.I.P. Nusi!
Marlo Mike later recanted his confession, claiming crooked cops forced it out of him by threatening him with lethal injection and jail time for his mother and stepfather. He said interrogators also told him Boosie had put a $25,000 bounty on his head. In court, prosecutors dramatically forced him to show the jury his tattoo, an AK-47 with the words "Yo, Boosie." Who's next, even though they already had enlarged photos of it. Police Sergeant Chris Johnson denied ever threatening Mike, but defense attorneys argued only a fraction of the long interrogations from May 2010 were taped, and only the confession was recorded. On camera, Mike could be seen exclaiming, "That dude want to kill me? He's getting out now?" Mike was soon identified as the common denominator in 5 separate shootings that left 6 people dead. He was charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Terry Boyd, Nusi, Marcus Thomas, and Charles Matthews, along with Daryl Bleak Milton, plus second-degree murder in the killing of Michael Smith. At 16 during 2 of those murders, he was too young for the death penalty. As his attorney put it, "He's a kid." The prosecutor countered, "He's an adult in the eyes of the law."
Man! That's wild. The law crooked. The law crooked. They should have gave him juvenile life. That nigga had 6 bodies. Okay. I was yapping.
At the very start of 2010, Michael "Ghost" Judson was murdered, marking the first homicide of the year in Baton Rouge. The shooting occurred within the first 30 minutes of the new year on the 3300 block of Charles Street near Acadian. Ghost, 22, was shot multiple times and later died at a hospital. Police could not determine a motive, though they suggested a possible argument prior to the shooting, and no suspect was ever identified. Witnesses nearby initially thought the gunshots were firecrackers. Ghost's mother, Zellarice Judson, remained in shock hours after receiving the news. "He was the kind of kid that always did what I asked. He had a lot of friends," she said. "Michael was the seed of my life. When they took Michael, they took everything. I wish my child was here." She added that healing would take time, but she would never rest until justice was served. Ghost had just celebrated his birthday a few weeks earlier. Another victim tied to Marlo Mike was Marcus "Gangsta" Thomas, who was fatally shot while driving his SUV in the 600 block of West McKinley Street near Nicholson Drive. Investigators determined that 3 different guns were fired into Marcus' vehicle. Though he wasn't alone, the passenger with him escaped unharmed and refused to cooperate with police. Mike admitted his role in the killing, saying he was one of the shooters. He described being in a car with Ghost and another associate when they spotted Marcus driving. The group pulled alongside him, and all 3 opened fire, Mike behind the wheel, Ghost, and the third man unleashing rounds. According to statements, Boosie had allegedly hired Ghost to carry out the hit after Marcus robbed him, even snatching a chain off his neck in front of his daughter, something Boosie never forgot. Not long after, on February 22, 2010, another shooting took place in the 5000 block of Tiago Street. The target was Noki, but instead his girlfriend, Malika Halbert, was struck while sitting in her kitchen just before midnight. She survived after being hit in the back. Noki was inside the house at the time, and investigators believed he was the intended victim. Less than 2 weeks later, on March 6, the same residence was hit again, this time with Eddie Stewart and Ryan Carroll alongside Noki. Then, less than a month later, both Noki and Daryl Bleak Milton were killed in a separate shooting. Ballistics linked shell casings from all 3 incidents together, tying them directly to the same circle of shooters. Police later alleged that the hit on Noki had been ordered by Reginald Youngblood.
Sneaks. Man, these niggas look like children.
Another name tied to the killings was Kendrick Johnson, who eventually pled guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the April 1, 2010 shootings of Charles Noki Matthews and Daryl Bleak Milton. Both men were gunned down while sitting in a car in Baton Rouge. Johnson had originally been scheduled to stand trial on first-degree murder charges, but prosecutors struck a deal after assessing the evidence. Although these murders happened in broad daylight and there were many people out there, only one person, other than Michael Louding, identified anyone, the prosecutor said. That witness only identified Kendrick Johnson and could not identify the other two shooters. The witness' credibility would have been a huge factor at trial due to his extensive criminal history and continuing criminal behavior. Based on Marlo Mike's taped statements and his 2010 grand jury testimony, he and four others, Johnson, Reginald Youngblood, Ryan Sneaks Carroll, and Jonathan Rogers, were all indicted for the killings of Noki and Bleak. But after Mike recanted, prosecutors were forced to drop the charges against Youngblood, Carroll, and Rogers. What made the case even more disturbing was Mike's behavior after the murders. Witnesses said that after shooting Noki and Bleak, he remained at the scene and even comforted Bleak's sister, who recalled, "I just want to know why. He called me his sister. He was like a brother to me." Other relatives remembered Mike staying close to the family afterward, even appearing at Bleak's funeral and offering condolences. To them, it was baffling, but prosecutors suggested Boosie had told him to do it as a cover, so no one would suspect a connection. Daryl Bleak Milton's death cut even deeper because he had once been one of Boosie's closest friends. The two had a strong bond, but it wasn't without conflict. While Boosie was serving a 4-year sentence on drugs and weapons charges, tension grew over Bleak's decision to hang around Johnny Red, a man who had previously stolen from Boosie's home. For Boosie, loyalty was everything, and seeing his supposed best friend spend time with someone who had violated him didn't sit right. The tension only escalated when word spread that Johnny Red had supposedly put a price on Boosie's head. Bleak knew about it but continued associating with Red regardless. Not long after, Bleak was gunned down alongside Noki. Whether Boosie had any role in arranging his death has never been proven, but the possibility lingered, and some believed it may have served as a motivating factor for Marlo Mike. Mike's violent streak didn't end there. He was also indicted for second-degree murder in the killing of Michael Smith, a 19-year-old found shot behind a home on Wisteria Street on December 18, 2009. That charge was eventually dismissed, but at the time, Smith was believed to be Mike's final victim of 2009. At the beginning of the legal process, Mike turned on his own crew, cooperating with authorities and providing statements that tied multiple associates to various murders. Most significantly, he implicated Boosie, telling detectives that the rapper had ordered the hit on Terry Boyd. His statements became the backbone of the case against Boosie and helped prosecutors indict him for first-degree murder. But when it came time to testify, Mike shocked the courtroom, recanting his statements and telling the jury that Boosie had nothing to do with Boyd's killing. He claimed his earlier confessions were coerced by investigators who had threatened him with the death penalty and the imprisonment of his family. With Mike reversing course, several co-defendants in the case struck plea deals, receiving sentences between 15 and 20 years. But for Boosie, the reversal proved critical. Mike even sent letters apologizing to him from jail, and later testified in Boosie's defense. In the end, the man prosecutors had once called the teen hitman helped clear Boosie of the murder charge, and Boosie badass walked free.
Man, that's how Boosie beat his case, y'all. This big news right here.
After Marlo Mike's conviction on April 26, 2013, the trial court originally scheduled his sentencing for September 12, 2013. However, the date was later moved up to July 9, a decision that sparked heavy objection from the defense. At a June 6 status hearing, Mike's attorneys argued that
they said Lil Fat was on the Bleak hit. That was crazy. Both were on the Bleak hit. Facts. I guess this is facts.
At a June 6 status hearing, Mike's attorneys argued that the accelerated schedule would severely hinder their preparation. They had retained a mitigation specialist, Juliet Yeakel, who was building a comprehensive timeline and gathering background evidence to present during sentencing. Compressing the schedule, they argued, would make it impossible to secure full psychological evaluations and other mitigating material. The prosecution countered by saying that a mitigation specialist wasn't necessary, since the judge himself was fully capable of weighing sentencing factors. They also stressed that Yeakel wasn't a psychologist but rather a defense attorney with experience in capital cases, hired to support Mike's legal team. To further undercut the defense's argument, the state introduced Mike's school records and pointed out that he had already been evaluated by two mental health professionals, Dr. Joy Terrell and Dr. Andrew Morrison. The court ultimately stuck with the July 9 date, rejecting the defense's repeated requests for a delay. The judge emphasized that a pre-sentence investigation report, PSI, had already been ordered and that he needed nothing from a mitigation expert. While he allowed both sides to introduce mitigating evidence under House Bill 152 and offered to sign orders for additional school, medical, or criminal records, he refused to push sentencing back. As a small concession, the court extended the time frame for filing a motion to reconsider, so the defense could continue pursuing mitigation after sentencing. On July 3, defense attorneys again argued that the PSI was inadequate because it evaluated rehabilitation only from a probation and parole officer's standpoint, not that of a psychologist. They pushed for more time to secure a psychological evaluation, but the court denied the motion. At the July 9, 2013 sentencing hearing, the state called Major Michael Vaughn of Louisiana State Penitentiary's investigative services. Vaughn testified about a letter Mike had mailed to Boosie 3 months earlier, on April 9, 2013. In it, Mike reminisced about them good old days, F-Hose, smoke and perp, clubbing, which the prosecution used to undercut the defense's argument that Mike was remorseful or deserving of leniency. In mitigation, defense counsel attempted to call their mitigation.
Nigga talking about you reminiscing about the old days. Well, that was crazy. You know you don't supposed to send no stuff like that to co-defendants and stuff like that. He was tripping.
Specialist, EMS, Juliet Yeakel, to testify on Mike's behalf. The state immediately objected, pointing back to the trial court's earlier statement that it required nothing from a mitigation specialist. Defense counsel responded that the court's prior remark was made only in the context of denying an extension of the sentencing date, not as a blanket ruling against mitigation testimony. They argued that preventing EMS Yeakel from testifying would effectively bar Mike from presenting important mitigating evidence to the court. The prosecution countered that Yeakel's testimony was not truly expert evidence but instead an attempt to introduce second-hand information from family members and acquaintances under the guise of expertise, describing her role as that of a mitigation investigator rather than a qualified expert. Defense counsel maintained that Yeakel's background and training made her qualified to testify as an expert on mitigating circumstances in capital cases, and, alternatively, that she should at least be allowed to testify as a lay witness about her personal knowledge of Mike's history. The trial court rejected this argument, making clear that it was not interested in hearing Yeakel's credentials, professional background, or the general work she had performed in preparing Mike's case. Instead, the court explained it only wished to hear from witnesses with direct, first-hand knowledge of Michael Louding's life and character. As a result, Yeakel was permitted to testify only in a limited capacity regarding a few steps she had taken to investigate Mike's past, but she was barred from offering her own conclusions or expert opinions. Ultimately, most of her statements were excluded after the state successfully objected to them as hearsay from a non-expert witness. Following Yeakel's testimony, the defense presented several witnesses close to Mike, including his mother, Sharon Louding, his aunt, Peggy Palmer, his sister, Lakendra Louding, and Baton Rouge Public Defender Jack Harrison. Mike's family members collectively described the hardships of his upbringing, painting a picture of a childhood marked by instability, poverty, and exposure to violence. They testified that he grew up in an overcrowded household in a high-crime neighborhood, where, at a young age, he witnessed a man being shot and killed. His education also reflected these struggles. He performed poorly in school, except during a brief period when he thrived in a military-style program that offered him structure and discipline. After leaving that program and returning to a traditional school setting, however, he again fell behind and was eventually expelled. Lakendra testified that while Mike did have anger issues, he was never violent toward others. His life took another turn at 14, when he began living with Boosie, a change that deeply worried his mother, who feared Boosie's influence. Sharon also testified that Mike once confided he was hearing voices, and though she tried to get him professional help, he resisted, fearing he would be institutionalized. Despite the challenges, Mike's family members expressed unconditional support, telling the court that if he were ever paroled, he would always have a home with them. Jack Harrison testified and briefly recounted Mike's history within the juvenile justice system. He noted that Mike had committed juvenile offenses including possession of a handgun and careless operation, along with some deferred drug charges. Harrison described his visit to Mike's home, observing that while it was clean, it was sparsely furnished, reflecting the family's financial hardships. He further testified that Mike had never been adjudicated as a child in need of care, nor had his family ever been found to require services. Mike then addressed the court briefly, expressing remorse and regret for his actions. He apologized to the victims' families and stated that, had he known then what he knows now, he would not have committed the offenses. The state also read a short impact statement from Terica Boyd, Terry's sister. The pre-sentence investigation report concluded that Mike's prior and current actions indicated he could not be rehabilitated and recommended a sentence of life imprisonment at hard labor, without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence. In imposing this sentence, the trial court cited extensive reasons, noting it was following the legislature's guidelines for individualized sentencing hearings for juvenile homicide offenders. The court remarked that Mike might find redemption in prison, observing that Mike's letter to Boosie suggested he intended to stay in the Bible. The court stated it had thoroughly reviewed the PSI, including the details of Mike's extensive criminal history, and had considered the Miller factors. The court described Mike as possessing common sense and being very street smart, despite being only 17 at the time of the homicide. It also acknowledged the personal and familial pressures Mike faced, including exposure to a gangsta lifestyle and Boosie's influence. The court emphasized the leadership role Mike played in Boyd's murder. While noting its belief that every offender has potential for rehabilitation, The trial court concluded that Mike represented the worst of the worst and sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor, without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence. Following his initial sentencing, Mike filed a motion to reconsider the sentence, accompanied by a motion for leave to complete his mitigation investigation. In these motions, Mike argued that the trial court had failed to consider all relevant mitigating factors under Miller v. Alabama. Defense counsel specifically cited records intended to demonstrate Mike's potential for rehabilitation, including supplemental security income, SSI, records, special education records, juvenile court records, child protective services records, psychiatric records, and
Boy, they pulled everything out the wazoo to try to get a better sentence in. They, damn, what?
medical records. However, many of these records primarily reflected circumstances within Mike's childhood household and did not directly pertain to Mike himself. Mike's resentencing hearing occurred on February 7, 2014. The defense called Dr. Frederick Sauter, a clinical psychologist, who was accepted by the trial court as an expert in clinical psychology and in diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly in veterans. Dr. Sauter had interviewed Mike on December 27, 2013, in preparation for the resentencing. During the evaluation, he identified a number of traumatic events in Mike's life that qualified as traumatic stressors. These included witnessing a murder, experiencing the murder of a childhood friend, an alleged sexual assault against Mike's sister committed by another family member, and allegations that Mike himself had suffered abuse during childhood. Dr. Sauter testified that in situations where individuals experience traumatic events, their vulnerability to PTSD is mitigated when they have social support. From his interview with Mike, Dr. Sauter believed that Mike likely lacked consistent support from his biological family. He further explained that individuals suffering from PTSD often turn to substance abuse as a coping mechanism to avoid confronting past traumas. Dr. Sauter emphasized that while Mike's extremely impoverished home environment would not in itself constitute a traumatic stressor, the broader context in which trauma occurred was a critical factor for consideration. He characterized Mike's expulsion from school in 7th grade as an example of adversity that likely compounded his developmental challenges. In summary, Dr. Sauter testified that Mike endured severe trauma at a young age, which had a significant impact on his psychological and emotional development into adulthood. At that point, Dr. Sauter could not conclude that Mike was irretrievably broken or beyond rehabilitation. He noted that if Mike did suffer from PTSD, the condition was treatable, with approximately 70 to 80% of treated patients showing substantial symptom reduction. Dr. Sauter further recommended that additional evaluation of Mike was warranted, including interviews with family members and a biologically oriented psychoanalysis, to more fully understand his mental health and rehabilitative potential.
Right. Well, he trying to fight to get about that thing.
In resentencing Mike to life imprisonment at hard labor, the trial court again articulated extensive reasoning for its decision. The court first referenced the evidence presented at trial concerning Mike's involvement not only in the instant homicide but also in several other violent acts. The court stated that in preparation for the resentencing hearing, it had carefully reviewed the records submitted by the defense, the transcript of Mike's interrogation, the letter he had sent to Boosie, and various items admitted into evidence during the trial. The trial court noted that Dr. Sauter, Mr. Harrison, and M'*S. Yekel had not been present for any portion of the original trial proceedings. While recognizing Dr. Sauter's opinion that Mike's participation in the homicides might have been influenced by conditions such as PTSD and depression, factors which could serve as mitigating circumstances, the court emphasized that these conditions did not constitute justifications or excuses for Mike's conduct. The court specifically found that nothing about the circumstances of the Boyd homicide correlated directly with the potential stressors identified by Dr. Sauter. The trial court concluded that it could not establish a clear nexus between Dr. Sauter's psychological findings and the criminal acts committed by Mike. Consequently, the trial court reaffirmed its prior sentence of life imprisonment at hard labor, without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence, citing the gravity of the offenses, Mike's leadership role in the homicide, and the lack of mitigating connection between his mental health conditions and the crime itself. With respect to Dr. Sauter's finding that Mike is capable of rehabilitation, the trial court observed that Mike's teachers had testified he was capable of learning. The court noted that while Mike was provided with appropriate educational models, he failed to take advantage of those opportunities. Instead, the trial court found that Mike frequently chose to engage in antisocial behavior and disregard the educational and social supports available to him. After considering all the evidence presented by the defense, the court concluded that Mike had not met his burden to demonstrate a capacity for rehabilitation. Continuing its reasoning, the trial court found no evidence that Mike's decision-making at the time of the offense was meaningfully impaired by mental illness, depression, or substance use in a way that would constitute a mitigating factor. The court acknowledged that Mike had lived in overcrowded and substandard housing, but it emphasized that he and his siblings' basic needs were nonetheless met within a supportive and loving environment. Regarding Mike's youth, the court determined that his chronological age and any developmental immaturity were not sufficiently significant to warrant substantial consideration as mitigating factors. The court further detailed the circumstances of Boyd's murder, noting that Mike had committed the act with a sense of pride and out of loyalty to Boosie. Taking all of these considerations together, the trial court concluded that the likelihood of Mike embracing redemptive behavior was low, stating that the root of his personhood has become incorrigible. For these reasons, the court characterized Mike as the worst of the worst and the rarest of the rare of juvenile offenders, and it reaffirmed the original sentence of life imprisonment at hard labor, without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence. Again, the sole issue raised by Mike in his motion to suppress concerned whether the videotaped recordings of his interrogations provided any proof that his Miranda rights had been read to him at any point during questioning. At the time of these interrogations, Mike was indisputably in custody. At both the suppression hearing and trial, Detective Howard testified that Mike was advised of his Miranda rights on each occasion that detectives spoke with him. A review of the videotaped confessions indicates that, with respect to the May 14, 2010, and May 17, 2010, interrogations, Mike was clearly informed of his Miranda rights. Notably, during his first interrogation, Mike began to explain his understanding of Miranda rights to the officers before they had even read the rights to him. At no point during any of the recorded interviews did Mike request an attorney or otherwise ask for a break from questioning. He appeared fully cognizant of his rights, demonstrated an understanding of them, and voluntarily waived those rights in order to speak with police. In sum, considering the totality of the circumstances, the evidence demonstrates that Mike's statements on May 14 and May 17 were made following proper advisement and waiver of Miranda rights by the interrogating detectives. Contrary to Detective Howard's testimony, the videotapes of Mike's May 18, 2010, and May 19, 2010, interrogations do not reflect that Mike was explicitly Mirandized immediately prior to his interactions with the police on those dates. Although the majority of these interactions involved Mike identifying individuals from photographic lineups, he did make several inculpatory statements regarding certain homicides. Nonetheless, the record demonstrates at such a young age demonstrates a shocking level of coldness and callousness. Mike received the harshest sentence among his co-defendants because he was responsible for the majority of the crimes and was the common factor across all the murder cases. While his severe mental health issues and environmental influences may have played a role in his development, they do not excuse the gravity of his actions. This concludes the summary of today's case. Thank you for reading, and stay tuned for more content on cases like this. That wraps up this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay safe, and may God bless you all. Hosanna in Excelsis.
Okay. I ain't gonna lie, Marlo Mike is a product of living fast, bro. Marlo Mike is a product of living fast. By 17, he was gone in the jailhouse, prison. So, I'm gonna say this: don't live fast. Do not live fast, man. Go be a child, man. Life ain't that hard, you know. Enjoy your childhood. Enjoy your life. Not this way though. Not that way. It's your boy Snore. I'm gone.